Welcome into One of One Sports. It was a really awesome week of college football this weekend. So many heavyweight matchups, and we can't wait to break it all down. So let's get right into it. And we're just going to start off with what were the biggest games. We had a ton of top matchups, but you got to lead with Ohio State, Oregon. Oregon was able to defeat Ohio State 32-31. It was a back and forth game, a ton of big moments. I mean, right from the start, very controversial. Oregon gets the interception, and they call it an Ohio State catch, actually, and Ohio State scores a touchdown. I thought that had the potential to be like a key part when if Ohio State won, like you pointed at that moment, is changing the course of the game. But Oregon's able to still battle back and win. Then there were a ton of big things to happen in this game. One huge part for me was I thought Ohio State underutilized their mismatch on the perimeter. Thought Jeremiah Smith and Emeka Egbuka especially could have been targeted even more so on the Oregon DBs, and then Oregon really exposed Ohio State's inability to cover over the top, especially with Evan Stewart on some of those deep passes. Evan Stewart just had a great game. We know he's talented. Was once the number one receiver recruit in the country, and he was great. Other than that, Jordan Birch was missing for Oregon, but Mateo Uyunglele stepped up and played really well. But ultimately, it did come down to what I thought it would come down to, and that was at the end of the game when Oregon had to go down the field. Dylan Gabriel made the big throws. He made a play with his legs. He got Oregon in position, and when Will Howard was tasked with the same thing, he didn't manage the clock correctly. He fell down on that one play. It was overall, you could just tell Oregon had the better quarterback, and in the high-pressure situation was better prepared to win them the game. Will Howard was not, and that was actually the exact reason I pointed out in my video why I was taking Oregon. I picked Oregon 31-28 in a close one, and that was exactly why. Because, Ohio State, though, you still set up to win. You had the ball at the Oregon 28, and all you need was a field goal. Jeremiah Smith gets the offensive pass interference. Then eventually, Will Howard runs out the clock. So as poor clock management. Ryan Day probably should have taken that timeout instead of letting the clock run down the play before. So it was just a lot of errors made when they were set up perfectly to win the game. And if they would have won 34-32 in a game where Oregon missed the extra point and then missed the 2-point conversion, essentially leaving 2 points on the board, right? That would have just been a brutal, brutal way to lose. But I felt like Oregon did look like the slightly better team for most of the game. Now, they were pretty even, but I thought the correct team won. But it was an awesome game, and I would say a pretty decent chance we see it again. Obviously, both teams will have tests. Oregon still has to play Michigan, although Michigan's not what we thought they were going to be, or at least what I thought they were going to be. They have to play Wisconsin, who looks like they're improving. Then Ohio State has tough games. Nebraska could be tough. Indiana's pretty good. And then, of course, the road game at Penn State's going to be really tough. But definitely lived up to the billing of the top three matchup. I think we'll probably see it again. And it was an awesome game to watch. The second big game of the day, this one happened before, but, another big, huge Big Ten matchup, and that was Penn State traveling to Southern California, where they did get the win in overtime, 33-30. This was another Clash of the Titans type of matchup. Obviously, USC was unranked, but I think we can agree USC is a pretty good team. They've taken down LSU this year, who's ranked, 13th, I think, in the AP poll. But USC, they got upset by Minnesota, and they lost a hard-fought game to Michigan. But so you versed Penn State here, and it was really the opposite of what we've seen from USC most of the year, because USC's been getting off to slow starts and then coming back in the second half. This time, they jumped out on Penn State, get up 20-6 at halftime, and then they aren't able to maintain that lead. They let Penn State back in the game. But I talked about, if you watched my breakdown video, how this was going to be a Lincoln Riley and Andy Kotelnicki game, the OC for Penn State, and how both teams were going to need to be creative with their play calling. Lincoln Riley to give Miller Moss time and have the O-line hold up better against a really good Penn State pass rush. And then Penn State just needed to be more creative because the offense a lot of times looks bland and doesn't look explosive at all. And then what do we get? We get one of the most creative play calling games. Well, Lincoln Riley was creative. Andy Kotelnicki was just crazy. The way he was using Tyler Warren all over the field. So many great play calls. But yeah, having him snap the ball then run to the end zone, throw it to him, having him line up at quarterback, running back, just using him in any way he can made the offense so much more dangerous. And shout out Tyler Warren, having over 200 receiving yards and 17 catches as a tight end while doing all the other things he was doing, blocking, completing some passes, running the ball, snapping the ball. It was just an incredible game from him. One of the best games from a tight end I've seen ever in college football. And then USC also got creative. The fake reverse to Zachariah Branch, which allowed for the big 75-yard run by Joyner. So they were creative as well, and they were in a good position to win this game. Ultimately, a little bit of poor clock management at the end, or when Miller Moss ends up throwing the interception. I thought USC was going to be able to get a field goal there. And then in overtime, probably could have had some calls go your way with the pass interferences, but they didn't, and then you missed the field goal, which allowed Penn State to win the game. It was a really good. This was another great game, lived up to all the hype. I was impressed by USC's ability to kind of withstand the run game, and Penn State did have to, but I was also responded by Penn State being able to find other ways to move the ball down the field. And then Penn State, I think for me, they emerged as like a real contender here because up to this point, I was like, okay, the defense is still good like normal, but it's still not an explosive offense. They're just like Penn State before. But if Tyler Warren, obviously he can't play like that every week, but if they use him in these creative ways and Drew Aller can play like he did, especially in that final drive, making those huge fourth down throws, like if he's going to be that kind of player, and then you bring in what Nick Singleton can do with his explosiveness and Julian Fleming emerging at the end of the game, this could be a real threat in the Big Ten, just like Ohio State and Oregon. Next up, we had the Ole Miss LSU game, and LSU won this 30-26. Another overtime game. So all these big matchups, well, except one, I guess. We'll talk about Texas later. All these big matchups really went down to the wire. Were great games, and this one, it took forever. This game was so long, so many stoppages. So that kind of took out the excitement in some ways. But Ole Miss, this is brutal. You had no place losing this game. You're winning. I think, LSU led for 0 seconds of this game because they didn't take lead till the last play of overtime on the touchdown. But so Ole Miss leading the whole game, in control the whole time, and then they let fourth down conversions happen at the end, and they let LSU go on a long drive to tie the game at 23 at the end of regulation. There were just plays. There were plays there to be made. You were in position, and you let Garrett Nussmeier make some big throws on huge conversions that end up costing you the game, which is brutal. But then also, both teams made costly mistakes. Turnover on downs deep into territory, followed interceptions by Nussmeier, interceptions by Dart in the end zone, forcing things. So it was sloppy play, but Ole Miss looked like the better team for the majority of the game and kind of just fell apart at the end, which is tough to see because now that's your second loss of the season, which is going to make, if you told me the preseason they are a second loss, I'd be kind of saying they're probably not going to make the playoff. But with the way this season's, shaking out, you don't know what's going on. There could be a lot of teams with 2 losses. So they're definitely not eliminated, but it obviously makes the path tougher to get to the playoff. On the LSU side, this is still not a team I believe in to do big things. Maybe I'll be wrong, but I still think it's a team that kind of just plays to their competition level. I think they got somewhat lucky. I think not lucky because they had to make the big plays, but I think this is a game you survive, and then you've already lost to USC, who I don't think is a great team. I thought you survived the South Carolina game, getting a little bit lucky with some of the calls the refs made. So I haven't been really impressed by LSU, and I don't believe in them going forward, but it's still a huge win for them, and it was a great game. Now that we've done the game breakdowns, we talk about what were some things I was right about on the weekend, what was I wrong about outside of the big games, and I was wrong about Alabama. I thought it was going to be a get-right game for them, playing South Carolina off the big loss to Vanderbilt. I thought they were going to come out and kind of pretty much dominate South Carolina the way we saw Ole Miss dominate South Carolina. And to start off, when they were up 14-0, I thought that's what we were headed towards. And then that's definitely not how it happened. South Carolina scores 12 points in the final 2 minutes of the first half, then takes the lead in the second. And it looks like they're going to win it, but then Lenore Sellers made some really, really bad mistakes that he's gonna have to improve a lot, and he's going to have to learn from them. But, fumbling the snap after the Jalen Milroe interception to give Alabama the ball back and take the lead was very costly. Then the interception at the end of the game was also very costly. The missed 2-point conversion when he had open receiver, all very costly mistakes by Lenore Sellers that if he had made them, Alabama's sitting at it has a second loss. I mean, if the way Diego Pavia took over the game, if Lenore Sellers had made a few more plays, we would have seen the same thing. Alabama would have lost at home to South Carolina, which would have been really crazy to see. And it was just not something I was expecting at all. I picked Alabama, obviously, to win, which they did. But yeah, it's definitely concerning, and I'd be a lot more concerned with them playing Tennessee next week if not for how Tennessee looked. So there's a lot of questions around both those teams right now that you got to get answered before you play, because it's still a very tough game for Alabama. Tennessee's tough game for Tennessee at Alabama, but huge question marks about Alabama's defense and Tennessee's offense for me, which is interesting. But next up, something I was actually right about, and that's going to be the Iowa Hawkeyes and how they were able to handle Washington 40-16. I talked about the travel. I talked about Washington getting the big win over Michigan, being in a letdown spot, how they weren't great in the red zone, and Iowa could capitalize on that. And though Will Rogers hadn't turned the ball over much this year, Iowa could force him to. All of which I think showed up in a dominant win for Iowa 40-16. Don't need to spend too much time on it, but just something I was right about on the weekend. And then another thing I was wrong about and continue to be wrong about is BYU and Arizona for that matter. But this was a lot like the Kansas State game and the fact that BYU just continues to force a ton of turnovers. I believe 4 turnovers this game. You got an interception in the end zone or at the 1-yard line by Fafita. Then coming out of the second half, he turns the ball over twice on the first 3 plays, and then he ends up throwing a pick 6 late. So it was just a really bad performance by Noah Fafita at quarterback for Arizona, but you got to give credit to BYU. This was the second game where they were able to force a ton of turnovers and end up winning dominantly over a team that I thought was pretty good. So yeah, they continue to be undefeated, and I still have a lot of questions about them, but they keep answering them, and I've continuously been wrong about BYU, so credit to them. Now, who are the most impressive teams of the weekend? And I'm not going to talk about the same teams that won the big games, and I'm also not going to talk about Texas. So these are kind of like, smaller, under-the-radar impressive teams we're going to mention here. The first one's Vanderbilt. I thought it was, after you beat Alabama in what's the biggest win in program history, and then you're going on the road to Kentucky, I thought you were definitely going to have a letdown. And even if you didn't have a letdown, Kentucky's still capable of beating Vanderbilt, obviously. But I thought having a letdown, there was no way, or not that there was no way, but I thought it was unlikely Vanderbilt was going to come out and play their best football. But they did for the most part. Diego Pavia goes out, comes back in, is still running around. Just such a tough kid. And Vanderbilt beats Kentucky. And now they're, I think, sitting at 4-2 with back-to-back SEC wins. So it's just been a great season for Vanderbilt. And now you've got Ball State left, so that you think would be a win. And then if you win one more SEC game, that would send Vanderbilt bowling. Now you got some tough games left. Texas still on the schedule, but you got Auburn's a winnable game. But we'll talk about that more at some point in the future. But yeah, huge win for Vanderbilt. Back-to-back wins in SEC for, I don't know how long it's been, but for the first time in a long time. Second for me was the Arizona State Sun Devils. I was at this game. It was really fun. Got stormed the field as they beat Utah. But yeah, I was impressed because Cam Rising was actually coming back playing, and he was definitely rusty. That he was wearing this big glove, and there were clearly some missed throws by him that he probably makes if fully healthy. He ends up going with 3 interceptions. But I was really impressed by ASU and especially Cam Scatabo, the scat back, the plays he's able to make. He broke a couple long touchdowns, caught a big 3rd down pass, diving out, kind of won the game by himself. But just overall, ASU was picked to finish dead last in the Big 12, and now they're 5-1, just beat a ranked opponent in Utah. And at this point, I don't think you can rule them out from being a Big 12 contender. With how the Big 12 looks, how crazy it is. So that means, all these teams in the Big 12 have a chance to make the college football playoff if any of them win. Now, right now, I think Kansas State, Iowa State, BYU, probably even Texas Tech look better than ASU. But ASU clearly a good team and could make some noise potentially as we head down to the latter part of the season. Then the third game I have, and that's going to be third team, is Iowa State, who defeated West Virginia 28-16. I didn't get to watch too much of this game, but what I was really impressed by was I thought this was definitely an upset spot on the road in West Virginia, and I thought it was going to be a tight game for sure. But Iowa State pretty much controlled it. It was never really in question, And that's impressive just seeing how crazy the Big 12's been, one. And it seems like, anybody can beat anybody. Not even just in the Big 12. We saw, obviously, in the SEC with Tennessee and Alabama going down last week. We've seen, Notre Dame. There's been big upsets. And the Big 12 especially has been so evenly matched. I thought this could be another spot for it. I thought Iowa State would win, but I was expecting a really tight matchup. And they were just able to control it, which was really impressive to me. And now I think they're in prime position. They're another team that looks like a playoff team at this point in the season. But we'll move on to just a couple more game analysis I wanted to do. And the first one's going to be the Red River Shootout and what was an absolutely dominant win for Texas 34-3. I could have put this in most impressive, but I wanted to give it a few minutes to stand alone. And what was really impressive about this game is if you watch my breakdown, I talked about Quinn Ewers coming back after not playing. I was like, he could be rusty. He could throw an early interception. He could miss some throws. And you could see Oklahoma jump out to like an early lead. And then with, a good defense, they could play from ahead, maybe control time of possession. And that could be the recipe for an upset. And so that's what I was looking for, right? And Quinn Ewers comes out and he throws the early interception and then he misses throws. And Oklahoma doesn't capitalize on any of it. They go up like 3-0. And what could have been like an early like 14-0, at least 10-0 lead, get double-digit lead on Texas, and then use your great defense to try to control the game. But they just can't capitalize on it. So I thought the recipe for an upset was there, but Texas's defense is also so good. Now, of course, Oklahoma's offense, very bad. But I was still impressed by Texas' ability to bounce back. And then eventually Quinn Ewers got it rolling. And Texas has all those threats on the perimeter. Of course, it's interesting to see because there's a few plays that could go differently, If Oklahoma converts on some of those early plays, if Silas Bolden doesn't recover that fumble in the end zone to still score for Texas, maybe Oklahoma could have given a little bit more of a test, but that's not what happened. And Oklahoma ends up being dominated here. I did want to talk about the quarterback situation, though, because I feel like Jackson Arnold was unfairly maligned here because he gets subbed out of the Tennessee game because he was not playing well. And he'd had some struggles up in the early parts of the season, but he'd also been good in some games. Like first half of the Tulane game, I thought he was really good. He obviously struggled in the Houston game, was bad in Tennessee. But anyways, he's replaced with Hawkins, and Hawkins has not been good either. He really struggled against Auburn. Is really the defense that kind of won him that game. Now Hawkins made the big throw, the one big throw, the deep shot. But for the most part, he wasn't great, and that was against Auburn, who's not a great team. And then against Texas, he was, he was bad. That's just, and he's a true freshman. That's what I expect. But I just feel like Jackson Arnold got taken out so early and like scapegoated, and that he was not really the main problem with the offense. So I don't like to see that. Texas, again, dominant. I think should still be the number one team in the country. It was, not an exciting Red River shootout, but an important one for seeing the landscape of college football. Last game analysis, and that's Tennessee, Florida. Tennessee was able to win 23-17 in overtime, just avoiding a second straight upset. We saw Graham Mertz go down with injury here. DJ Lagway, the 5-star true freshman, had to come in and try to he played throughout the game, but he had to try to win it for Florida. He ended up tying the game, got a huge 3rd and 18 touchdown pass to send it to overtime, in which I thought it was obvious Florida should have went for 2. Billy Napier disagreed, send it to overtime, in which Florida, imploded. They went so far backwards on their drive and then couldn't stop Tennessee. So they end up losing. But, the bigger talking point's got to be huge concerns for Tennessee. That offense, it's just not good. Which is crazy to say because Josh Heupel, has his reputation of being an offensive genius, which he's earned, right? He's had great offenses. And then early in the season, they broke the record for, biggest, win margin or, acquired through, 3 games or whatever it was. But obviously they're playing very easy teams. But still, it was the all-time record. And then they come out, and against Oklahoma, the offense isn't very good, but it's overlooked because they still dominated Oklahoma, and Oklahoma's offense was even worse. And Nico made some mistakes that game, but Jackson Arnold made worse mistakes. So it's overlooked. Then we see again against Arkansas, but I was still kind of waving it off as just, road game. Nico maybe struggles on the road a little bit. Weird game. But then you come back home, and the offense is bad again against Florida. So it's now a real concern of what's wrong with this Tennessee offense, and why is it? It put up 0 points. I think back-to-back weeks, 0 points in the first half, which is wild to say for Tennessee. That's a huge point. And now Florida, this one's got to hurt. This would have been a huge win for Billy Napier. just barely losing it. I don't really understand why he didn't go for 2 to try to get the win, but he didn't, and it ended up costing him the game. But that was our final game analysis. So now we can move on. Just some quick other games I want to talk about. North Carolina allowing a 60-yard run with only 40 seconds left to lose the game was just embarrassing. Wisconsin, I was surprised by how good the offense looked and how dominant they were playing Rutgers, who I thought was a pretty good team. Illinois, didn't watch this game because it was Illinois-Purdue, but ended up blowing a 27-3 lead, then winning 50-49. So it seems like it's a crazy game. I didn't get to see much of it, but I wonder what Purdue found, because now they're hosting Oregon on a Friday this week after Oregon's big win. So could that be another crazy upset we see? It's something I'm looking at. And then Kansas State, Colorado. Thought Kansas State had this game secure, and then Colorado actually comes back in the fourth quarter, only for Kansas State to regain the lead right before the end and win it, and was a great Big 12 game. So what were the biggest takeaways from the weekend? To wrap it up, number 3, Texas may be the only elite team. And I say that because every other team has looked vulnerable except Texas. Ohio State lost to Oregon. Oregon, we saw the whole state of Idaho take them down to the wire. Alabama's lost. Georgia's lost. Miami, we've seen struggle twice. Clemson lost to Georgia. So all the top teams. Maybe you could say, well, Penn State just went down to the wire at USC, so you can't even say Penn State anymore. But yeah, so all the top teams have struggled at some point except Texas, so they may be the only elite team. Number 2, Oregon and Ohio State are legit. So is Penn State. Like I mentioned, Oregon and Ohio State, very evenly matched, played a great game. Both are still true Big Ten and national title contenders, but I think Penn State looks like they might actually be on their level this year, or at least close to it, because of Andy Kotelnicki and how creative he can get with that play calling. And with Drew Aller looking like he's going to be the guy to make big-time plays when they need him to. Seeing him make those fourth down conversions, seeing Andy Kotelnicki make those creative play calls, gave me confidence that this Penn State offense, when they verse Ohio State, will be able to make plays that will at least give them a chance to win, and they still have a great defense. So that's my take on how the top of the Big Ten's looking. And then finally, the SEC and Big 12, I think, are just too unpredictable. Thought I was getting a grasp for it, but we still see U of A now just kind of bad. ASU's beating Utah. BYU's still very good. Iowa State just continues to roll. Kansas State, Colorado was crazy. So, I just don't really know what's going to go on in that conference. There's half the conference can make the playoff, and it wouldn't surprise me. Anyone of the top half of the conference. And then the SEC, it's just Ole Miss has been really inconsistent. LSU's been really inconsistent. Alabama and Tennessee have huge problems. Georgia sneakily kind of struggled against Mississippi State, which was weird. So there's just so much unpredictability in both these conferences that it makes it really fun to watch, but really hard to predict. Those are my final takeaways on Week 7's college football slate. It was an awesome weekend. Let me know what your guys' thoughts were. What were your favorite games, your favorite parts? Make sure to leave a like, do me a huge favor, and subscribe. Until next time.